You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. I am so excited about today's episode. So a few weeks ago, I did another episode called It's All in the Clouds, where I explored the symbolism of clouds and how they show up throughout the tarot. And you all just responded so positively to that episode. I was actually really surprised about how many messages and comments that I had received on that episode. So I wanted to kind of continue on with that theme, and symbolism's just been really heavy on my mind lately. I am so excited. I just finished up next year's journal. So if you got my year ahead hermit journal for 2025, rest assured, I am going to have another one for next year. And I finished it ahead of schedule. It's mostly finished. I have to go back and do all the edits, and I want to add some other fun things, but the meat of it is all done. And it took me several months to finish all of these essays, but I got it done. And my goal is to have it out into the universe by mid-November, hopefully sooner, but I'm giving myself to mid-November so I don't stress myself out with self-imposed deadlines. But anyway, I digress. Clearly symbolism has been heavy on my mind, and I wanted to explore the concept of what it means to not have your vision accessible in the tarot. So, I went through my Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and I was looking for any blindfolds, any where eyes are just somehow obscured, whether that's because the eyes are closed or the hands are in the face in some way. And I found 6 cards. I found the 2 of Swords, 4 of Swords, 8 of Swords, 9 of Swords. So basically all the swords, 10 of Wands, and Strength. So strength might confuse some of you, but just hang on till the end. I promise I'll explain why vision is obscured in strength. But yeah, we're going to dive into all of that today. I think the most well-known blocked vision cards are probably the 2 of Swords and the 8 of Swords. And I honestly kind of have an issue with the way that we tend to talk about the 2 of Swords in particular. And I'm entirely guilty of this. So no shade, because I do the same thing. But we tend to kind of automatically and immediately default to this cliche of, oh, you're at an impasse, you're indecisive, you just take the blindfold off, and you'll be able to see clearly so that you can make a decision. And, it's interesting because I think there's this like automatic assumption that because our vision is obscured, that's the problem, that, sight is kind of like inherently superior here, and that to make a decision or reach some sort of conclusion, find the solution, we have to be able to see. But as I was sitting here looking at this card, I was like, well, what if the blindfold is the intervention? Like, what if the blindfold is the answer? And what if the blindfold is not about not being able to quote unquote see, but more about not wanting to be kind of externally influenced? So what if it is the only thing creating a condition or conditions where we can make a sound decision? We rarely consider that option because, and I think about this because when one of our senses is taken away, our other senses sharpen. So, and there's lots of studies about this, especially regarding like sensory deprivation studies that show when, if we're just talking about kind of visual impairment specifically, when vision is restricted, our attention shifts to our other senses. So think, sound, smell, touch, or cognitive senses. What's happening? What are our thoughts? So, instead of asking, why won't this person just take the blindfold off? Why won't she just look? I guess I kind of wonder what would happen if we got curious about what else the person was experiencing. So instead asking, what is this person hearing now that maybe her sense of hearing is heightened? Or what stories is she playing? What is the mental kind of internal dialogue sound like now? Maybe she hears or they hear their own thoughts without, kind of the external static and distraction that is so easily able to take place when that sense is engaged. Maybe they sense the weight of the swords as something, more demanding, or maybe they're just more in touch with what the swords represent because they're not looking at them and they're feeling them. So it's more of a somatic experience when our vision is not kind of the primary sense being engaged. Or maybe without having the visual cue or experience, they're able to, because this is a sword suit, able to tap into what their internal voice is saying. Again, kind of like being able to separate everything that's happening externally. I was also thinking about this through the lens of kind of pressure to conform, and not even just to conform, but also to perform. When we are, when we're able to see kind of what's around us, we are automatically comparing ourselves. Oh, what should I do? Because this person did that, or this person did this, or this person, made this decision. So maybe I should make that decision. When we are not able to experience that, and we have, the blindfold present, we're really able to step into our own authenticity in that moment. And I identify, kind of our own needs and wants, which I think is really important here. So if we look at it through that lens, this card that I think so many of us automatically assign the word indecision to doesn't even represent indecision at all. It's more about protecting decision and making sure that it's not influenced or contaminated. So now if we move on to the Eight of Swords, because there's quite a contrast here, because the Eight of Swords still has a blindfold present, but I feel like the energy of these two cards, despite them both having blindfolds on, is so vastly different, because in the Eight of Swords, the blindfold doesn't appear to be like chosen. It's more like imposed upon, like someone clearly bound this person and then blindfolded them. Where in the Two of Swords, I feel like that person put the blindfold on themselves for a reason to maybe think more clearly. So now to juxtapose again that Two of Swords to the Eight of Swords, if the Two of Swords is self-imposed, the Eight of Swords, which we tend to think is self-imposed, I actually argue is not at all. And maybe we've been looking at this card wrong for so long because, I don't know how we would bind ourselves like that and then, also be able to put on a blindfold. So again, we tend to ask ourselves this question of, oh, just, break free of the fabric that has bound you and take off the blindfold and just leave. You have plenty of space. What would happen if we ask the question instead of, who would benefit from you being in that state? Because it immediately makes me think of boundaries. Because think about like if you have not had a particular boundary around, anything for quite some time, the moment you start to implement that boundary, it's really important to pay attention to how people react and respond, because the people who are not happy about that boundary that you just set are the ones who benefited when you didn't have the boundary. And so I think about that when I'm looking at the Eight of Swords through this lens. So who's benefiting from you being bound? Who's benefiting from you not being able to see? Because in the Two of Swords, there's kind of this there's a sense of empowerment. There's this sense of kind of personal agency. Like I am choosing to put this blindfold on so that other senses can be heightened. So I'm taking on this kind of uncomfortable role of impairing my own vision so that I can step into a heightened level of awareness in other ways. Where, with the Eight of Swords, it's totally different. It's the opposite, because with the Two of Swords, they're pretty calm. They're sitting up straight. They look confident. But with the Eight, their hands and arms are bound and they don't look comfortable. They look rather distraught or distressed to me. It doesn't look like a great position to be in. And so we can only kind of assume that someone else is trying to prevent this person from seeing something or leaving or maybe even interfering in one way. So the Eight of Swords becomes kind of like an act of captivity, where the Two of Swords would be the opposite. So I would maybe even argue that the presence of the blindfold is not as important as the source or reason for the blindfold. So because we tend to look at the image and say, oh, that person's blindfolded. And we don't ask questions, or we're not curious. Did we put it there ourselves, or did somebody else do it? Because the answer to that makes a huge difference in how we read the energy of the card and how it might apply to us in our current phase of life. I want to talk about the other two swords now, because they don't have blindfolds present in them, and that's the Nine of Swords and the Four of Swords. However, vision is still obscured. So with the Four, we kind of have this like peaceful closing of the eyes. Typically we see it as representing rest, maybe taking a nap. But with the Nine, we have the head in the hands, which, clearly indicates stress and discomfort. So in the Four of Swords, the eyes are closed because, this person's choosing not to look. There's this kind of willful retreat. And, it's like when we say, hey, I'm going to go rest my eyes, or I'm going to go take a nap, or I need to relax. This card is often read as rest. However, I think that that's little surface level for this, because we can look at it a little bit deeper and consider it as a form of lack of stimulation, lack of activity. So, think about when we're super overwhelmed and we just like can't handle any more stimulation. We need to close our eyes. We're closing our eyes so that we are not taking in any information. Because even when we're, overwhelmed and we're sitting in our home by ourselves, like sometimes even just looking around our home, even though it's maybe our safe space, can cause us more activation. Like maybe we see the pile of clothes we haven't put away, the dishes are piled up, there's that stack of mail you haven't gone through. So even though you are, not out in the public and you're not taking in all of that external stimulation and you're kind of in your calm, safe space, there's still other kind of visual stimulation that could overwhelm you. So the closing of the eyes eliminates that. So in this case, with the Four of Swords, we could look at the closing of the eyes as, this, eliminating sensory input, or the down regulation of the nervous system, deliberate narrowing of input. And it doesn't even have to be through like napping. We don't have to even be sleeping. It's just about protecting ourselves from what we're receiving. This is why, full-on sensory deprivation chambers exist too, which, is really interesting to think about. But I think that for the Four of Swords here, this is more in alignment with the Two of Swords, where we're intentionally stepping into the space. We are choosing to obscure one of our senses so that we can either make a decision based on our other senses or just reset our nervous system. So instead of maybe automatically assuming the Four of Swords is about rest, we can also maybe think of it as a form of repair, because we can't fully digest our experiences while we're still consuming it. We have to let things kind of fully process. And in this case, the Four of Swords is saying, hey, close your eyes. So the Nine of Swords is different. And I want to step into that space for a minute now, because I think the Nine of Swords is what happens if we don't allow ourselves to experience the Four of Swords. We get to the Nine of Swords when we have not implemented any sort of coping skills and we are in major sensory overload and anxiety has taken over. So in this card, the person, is covering their face, which is something that we do when we're so overwhelmed, so overstimulated that, I can't take it anymore. And we just automatically kind of put our hands to our heads. And, that could be because we're feeling shame, fear, guilt, usually kind of thinking of worst case scenarios. Oh my God, what am I going to do? And it's in these moments of panic that our minds end up creating even more threats that don't exist. And what's interesting here when we're thinking about it in terms of blocked vision is that when we are in that heightened of a state, when we are in that significant of a Nine of Swords moment, even if we open our eyes, we can't really take in what's happening. If you've ever experienced, intense panic or been around someone when they've experienced intense panic or a traumatic event even, they're kind of like deer in headlights. Their eyes are open, but they're not taking in anything that's actually happening. You might even be kind of putting your hands on their shoulders, shaking them and saying hey, do you see me? Do you see me? And so, this Nine of Swords is really fascinating in that regard, because I would say that it's suggesting that there's so much happening mentally that we can't take in anything externally, so it's that anxiety that's so loud. It's drowning absolutely everything else out around us. So what's interesting is with the Two and Eight of Swords, we see that vision is obstructed by a blindfold or, an intentional blindfold or a forced blindfold, circumstances where the Four and Nine of Swords, sight is technically available, but not accessible. But again, also either by choice or by circumstance. So 9 would be by circumstance, 4 would be by choice, 2 would be by choice, 8 would be by circumstance. And in the 4, this person is suspending sight in order to kind of preserve their mental and emotional state. And then in the 9, our anxiety is just so out of control that alone impairs our sight. So with the Four of Swords, we could even look at it as, okay, we're eliminating this sense, we're obscuring our vision for a moment so that we can allow reality to settle, or so that we could settle into reality. Whereas the Nine of Swords, vision becomes obscured because reality became so unbearable, but not just reality, also our imagination and fear of what could be a reality. All right, so now we get to move into the non-sword cards, We're going to talk about the 10 of Wands and strength next. So in the 10 of Wands, the eyes are not covered by a blindfold and they're not covered by our hands. They're actually covered by the wands, kind of, which is interesting because we could say it's like effort is what is obscuring our vision. And we know this card to obviously represent feeling overburdened, carrying too many demands. The figure's very hunched over. They look pretty fatigued. And, the weight of what they're carrying is making it hard for them to actually see what's in front of them. They can't really tell where they're going, but they know they can't stop going. They just have to keep moving forward. And so this card indicates a slightly different level of blocked vision. It's not related to anxiety. It's not related to trying to make a decision. It's really related to functioning in the level at which we are functioning. So we know that the 10 of Wands is all about carrying too much, whether that's responsibilities, the expectations we place on ourselves or the expectations others have placed on us, emotional labor, perfectionism, just feeling like you have to do it all. This could also be a FOMO card where we feel like we have to do everything because we have that fear of missing out. And when we're doing all of that and we're carrying all that, we can't really tell what the hell's going on around us. And we're not really even, looking ahead in any particular direction. We just got kind of head down, just do the thing. And from a clinical perspective, I see this a lot in people who are over functioning. They're just really going through the motions, trying to get it all done, feeling like they can't stop. There's no real capacity for different perspectives or taking a step back and trying to reprioritize. Really no ability to even self-reflect because all of your energy is going towards just carrying those wands and getting through. So they kind of metaphorically can't see anything else that's happening around them. And this inability to not be able to see what's happening around them isn't because, they, physically can't or won't. It's more of like a psychological and emotional, I just can't pick my head up long enough to see what's happening around me. So that level of visual deprivation stems more from being overburdened, being absolutely exhausted. So now we get to talk about strength. The one card that I feel like many of us wouldn't consider has some sort of visual deprivation attached to it. But I think strength is interesting out of this whole bunch. And for me, whenever I pull strength, I rarely focus on the figure or the angel that's present in the card. I think a lot of folks tend to. Make sense. They're the largest kind of presence on the card, but I tend to always be hyper focused on the lion. I'm sure that's something maybe worth analyzing about myself. But what I find interesting is the way in which the figure is kind of manipulating the lion. So while one hand is opening the mouth, the other is at the top of the head, and it kind of looks as if they're covering one of the lion's eyes. I always thought that was so interesting how that hand sits on the top of the lion's head. And, I'm wondering maybe it could be because they don't want the lion to have full visual access to, whatever might activate it. And by covering one eye, there's a reduction in the lion's ability to be reactive. But since both eyes aren't covered, it's not, the figure's not entirely stripping away all of that kind of personal agency. So the lion still has access to some of that sense. The figure is just kind of taking it into their own hands to manage the animal's arousal and activation because they're limiting the input, limiting the stimulus. And actually in therapy, it's similar to the concept of titration. So we're not exposing anyone to or exposing the nervous system to, 100% of the threat, for example. You're kind of like dosing it in bits. So it's similar to what we would call like systemic desensitization. And if we're looking at it through that lens, and damn it, no pun intended there, the lion can still see enough so that it doesn't feel entirely trapped, but its vision is obscured enough so that it's not just completely freaking out about what's going on. So if we think about it this way, when we can maybe then realize that, strength isn't necessarily about kind of controlling the lion like we automatically think it is. I think it's more along the lines of the Four of Swords kind of energy where we're limiting input. And in this case, more about strategically obscuring that input. So we're able to kind of be aware and also attempt to regulate at the same time. It kind of reminds me of like Steve Irwin and alligator wranglers in general. They would always cover the eyes of the gator in order to be able to get close to them. I remember, watching Steve Irwin, and him like throwing a towel or something over the gator's eyes. And that allowed them to completely step up to the gator because it limits their instinctual primal drive to react because that sense, they've been deprived of that. So I kind of wonder if that's what's happening in the strength card, so we're only partially obscuring this sense. So we still kind of like understand what's happening visually. However, with that partial deprivation, maybe we might not entirely react the way we would if we were completely able to see what was going on. I think after just sitting with this concept over the last few days, what I've discovered about this kind of concept of visual deprivation, partially obscured vision in the tarot specifically, and what it symbolizes is that it's not so much about limiting something or choosing not to look at something for what it is. I think it might be more interesting to consider it as revealing something. And, especially when we think about, the Eight of Swords and, who would benefit from us, not being aware of something, for example. But I think we all might be surprised at how much more depth our readings take on when we start to consider, what information becomes more available to us when one of our senses is obscured. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow The Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.